The city was alive with the hum of evening traffic, the chorus of 1,000 lives crisscrossing, colliding, and spinning their wheels toward some indistinct destination. But for Zhang Chen, a man trapped in his own head, it felt more like a cage. The fluorescent glow from the office building behind him flickered against his pale face as he stepped out onto the busy sidewalk, a place where the noise should have been comforting, like background music in a film. But it wasn't. Not anymore. For Zhang, every noise felt like an assault. He could hear the distant honking of horns, the rhythmic pounding of footsteps on concrete, the whir of a bus's engine winding its way through the city. Each sound, once ignorable, now cut through his brain like the slicing of a razor. His senses had become too sharp, and the world had grown too loud. Zhang ran his fingers through his short black hair, trying to settle the unease bubbling in his chest. A few months ago, the world had seemed predictable, boring, even. He had worked a mundane job as a geneticist in an unremarkable lab, studying mice and cell cultures, dreaming of something more exciting. Something more human. Or, perhaps, something more than human. And that's exactly what he had become. The experiment had been meant to push the boundaries of science. It was supposed to enhance human capabilities, elevate the body and mind to levels previously unimaginable. Zhang had volunteered eagerly, knowing the risks. But when he had walked into that lab, he hadn't understood just how much he was signing away. How much of himself would be left behind. Zhang had been injected with a series of experimental gene edits, an eagle's keen eyesight, a leopard's explosive speed, an ant's unimaginable strength. All of them, genetically fused into his DNA. The procedure had left him shaken, but the results? Nothing short of miraculous. For weeks, he reveled in his newfound abilities, speeding through the streets at a blur, watching the tiniest details with his enhanced vision, lifting weights that would have crushed any normal person, but that had been the high point. Now, every moment felt like a battle. His senses had become too sharp, too tuned in. The world around him was always there, demanding his attention, pushing him to react. His vision would often lock on a passing stranger's face, and suddenly, he could see their pores, their blood vessels, the minute tremor in their hand as they reached for their wallet. It wasn't a gift anymore, it was a curse. The leopard's speed wasn't any better. He would be walking through the crowded streets, and then, without warning, his body would surge forward, running, not out of joy, but out of impulse. His mind would scream to stop, but his body moved of its own accord, leaving behind chaos in his wake. And then there was the strength of the ant. At first, it had been fun, picking up a bus bench and tossing it across the park. But now, it was a constant struggle to avoid lifting and rearranging random objects, like the stack of office chairs in his cubicle that he had moved into a perfect pyramid, just because it felt right. All of these abilities had made Zhang a superhuman. But they had also made him less human. Today, though, the frustration had reached a tipping point that he stepped off the curb to cross the street, and his eyes locked onto a figure in the distance, a man in a suit, moving quickly through the crowd. Zhang's eagle vision zoomed in, and in an instant, he saw something that shouldn't have been possible. The man had dropped his wallet. The impulse kicked in. His mind screamed wait, but his body was already moving, his legs propelling him forward with lightning speed, dodging pedestrians, leaping over trash cans, and crossing the street in an almost surreal blur. In a fraction of a second, Zhang reached the wallet, scooped it up, and darted back toward the man. His heart was pounding, his body still humming with the aftershock of his reckless speed. The man, still unaware, walked on, his briefcase tucked under his arm, his back turned. Zhang's fingers clutched the wallet tightly, and a strange satisfaction settled over him. He held it up as he reached the man. "Excuse me," Zhang called, barely catching his breath. The man turned, looking confused for a moment. He blinked rapidly, then stared at Zhang as if seeing him for the first time. "How did you?" He trailed off, his eyes flicking from the wallet to Zhang's face. "Wait, did you just?" Zhang grinned. The rush of adrenaline had him feeling giddy, like a cat who had just caught a mouse. Eagle vision, he said casually, as if it were no big deal. Leopard speed. Ant strength. And I've been watching you for the past 5 minutes. The man blinked again, his mouth hanging open. What? Zhang laughed, handing the wallet back. You dropped it, he said, stepping away, already feeling the uncontrollable urge to move again. The need to run, to do something, anything. He could feel the muscles in his legs itching, the speed building up inside him, like a tiger pacing in a cage. The man stood there for a moment, staring after Zhang, but Zhang didn't wait. He had already started running, this time not to help, not to stop, but simply because it was the only thing his body knew how to do. Zhang slowed to a jog as he neared the edge of the park, panting. The air felt thick, almost electric with his heightened senses. He could hear the crunch of leaves beneath his feet, the whisper of wind through the trees. He had to stop running. He had to figure out how to get this under control. He collapsed onto a nearby bench, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. His chest rose and fell with each labored breath. It was getting harder and harder to ignore the animal inside him. The sound of footsteps reached his ears. They were fast, deliberate, too fast for a normal person. Zhang's head snapped up just in time to see a man in a gray hoodie approaching, his face hidden in shadow. Zhang's pulse quickened, his instincts kicking in. Predator or prey? His mind was already calculating the angle, the speed, the force. He could feel the animal's claws scraping at the edges of his thoughts. The man slowed as he came into Zhang's line of sight. His eyes flicked over Zhang, assessing him. Zhang's body tensed, muscles coiling, his hands gripping the bench. This was how it had been going lately, too much awareness, too much sensitivity. Too much animal. The man smiled. You okay, buddy? Zhang blinked, his instincts cooling just enough to recognize the concern in the man's voice. Focus. He forced himself to calm down, exhaling slowly, releasing the tension that had knotted his muscles. Yeah, he said, forcing a smile. Just a little too much on my plate lately. The stranger nodded sympathetically and walked past. Zhang stared at him, still feeling the echo of that primal urge to chase, to fight, to flee. How could he live like this? Zhang spent the next few days holed up in his apartment, trying to make sense of his increasingly erratic behavior. The apartment was small, just a studio with a half kitchen, a bed pushed up against the wall. It should have been a place of respite, but now, it felt like a prison. Everywhere he turned, he saw things he needed to fix, to move, to change. His ant strength made it impossible to resist the impulse to rearrange the furniture. Again, his mind raced with the possibilities. How could he balance these animal instincts with his humanity? Was it even possible to find that balance? The buzzing of his phone broke his thoughts. It was a message from Dr. Li, the head scientist who had overseen his transformation. Come in, it said. We need to talk. Zhang arrived at Dr. Li's lab late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the pavement. He had barely slept the night before, unable to calm the restless energy coursing through his body. Every nerve was on edge, every sense heightened. He could hear the muffled laughter of children playing in the park nearby, the distant hum of traffic, even the rustle of leaves caught in the wind. But nothing made the buzzing in his brain stop. Dr. Li's lab was tucked away in a quiet part of the city, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and non-disclosure agreements. The building looked ordinary enough from the outside, a dull, gray structure that could easily be mistaken for a government office or an old research facility. Zhang pushed through the glass door and stepped into the cool, sterile lobby. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, mixed with the faint scent of coffee. Dr. Li was already waiting for him, standing at the reception desk, holding a clipboard. Her short, dark hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and her glasses glinted under the fluorescent lights. As Zhang walked toward her, he noticed the faint circles under her eyes. She looked exhausted, but then again, they all had been working around the clock. The genetic enhancement project had been a high-stakes operation, one that had stretched everyone to their limits. Zhang, she greeted him, her voice calm but with an edge of concern. I'm glad you came. We need to talk. Zhang nodded, too distracted to say much. His thoughts were still scattered, his body still vibrating with nervous energy. What's going on, Dr. Li? Why did you message me? She glanced around, making sure no one was within earshot before she spoke. Come with me. They walked down the narrow hall, past doors that led to labs filled with equipment, some of it familiar, some of it new to Zhang. It all seemed so clinical, so detached, like something out of a sci-fi movie. But Zhang wasn't interested in the technology anymore. He was too consumed by the constant barrage of his animal instincts, too focused on how the world had become a battlefield for his senses. Dr. Li stopped in front of a door and unlocked it. Inside was a small, windowless room, filled with monitors and a few tables cluttered with papers. The lights were dim, casting shadows that stretched across the floor. Sit, Dr. Li instructed, gesturing to the chair opposite a desk. Zhang didn't need to be told twice. He slumped into the seat, trying to keep his movements calm, but even sitting still was a struggle. His muscles twitched, his body screamed for release. Dr. Li sat down across from him and sighed. We've been monitoring your progress, Zhang. The modifications are more powerful than we anticipated. But the side effects, Zhang stiffened. I know. I can't control myself anymore. The instincts, they're taking over. I can't focus, I can't relax. It's like I'm a machine running on autopilot. Dr. Li nodded. That's exactly it. The genes we inserted into you are far more complex than we originally thought. We engineered the abilities to enhance specific traits, vision, speed, strength. But we didn't account for how they would affect your mind. The instincts of the animals, the drive to hunt, to move, to exert strength, it's all pulling you in different directions. Zhang ran a hand through his hair. I can't live like this. I'm losing it. I can't stop myself. Yesterday, Dr. Li raised a hand to stop him. I know. We've been tracking your behavior. The speed, the strength, the sensory overload, it's all part of the package, I'm afraid. But there may be a way to counterbalance it. Zhang leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? You have a solution? I've been working on something, Dr. Li said, her tone quieter now. It's a recalibration process, a way to dampen the most extreme aspects of your animal instincts. If we can get you into a controlled environment, where we can observe and guide the process, we might be able to balance the human and animal sides of you. Controlled environment? Zhang repeated, his heart racing. Like what? A cage? Dr. Li shook her head. Not a cage. But we'd need to isolate you for a period of time. Control the stimuli around you, limit your exposure to external distractions. With some work, we can teach your brain to focus, to harness the animal instincts without letting them take over completely. Zhang was quiet for a long moment, turning over the idea in his head. It wasn't a perfect solution. But it was something. And right now, something was better than nothing. How long would it take? He asked finally. Hard to say, Dr. Li admitted. It could take weeks, or it could take months. Your body is adapting at an accelerated rate, so we need to move quickly before the instincts become permanent. Zhang felt a pang of fear, but he pushed it down. Okay. Let's do it. Dr. Li stood up, her face set with determination. Good. We'll begin tomorrow. But Zhang, she paused, her eyes searching his. I need you to be ready. This won't be easy. The instincts are strong. And you'll have to fight them every step of the way. I'm ready, Zhang said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. The next day, Zhang found himself back at the lab, lying in a reclined chair, hooked up to various machines. Dr. Li and a team of scientists moved around him, adjusting the settings on monitors and calibrating devices that Zhang couldn't quite understand. He had tried to sleep the night before, but sleep didn't come easily anymore. His body was too wound up, too restless. His mind kept racing through 1,000 different thoughts, all of them chaotic, all of them pushing him toward action. Dr. Li stood next to him, adjusting a headset on his head. "We're going to start slow, Zhang. We'll begin by controlling your sensory input, dampening the overload. I need you to stay calm. No matter what happens, don't let the instincts take over. Do you understand?" Zhang nodded, his throat dry. "I understand." Dr. Li's fingers hovered over a series of buttons on the console. "All right, we're starting now. Just focus on your breathing. Breathe in. Breathe out." Zhang closed his eyes, trying to follow her instructions. He took a deep breath, but it didn't help. He could feel the buzz in his chest, the tightness in his limbs. His body was itching to move, to run, to do something, anything. "Relax, Zhang. Just breathe." He focused harder, pushing away the impulse to move. He tried to silence the noise in his head, to quiet the roar of his instincts. For a moment, it worked. The world slowed down. He could feel the coolness of the chair beneath him, the steady beat of his own heart. The air felt thinner, cleaner, but then it came, the flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. He opened his eyes and saw a shadow dart across the room. His body jerked, and before he could stop himself, he was on his feet, moving toward the shadow. "Zhang, no." Dr. Li's voice cut through the air, but it was too late. Zhang's body was already in motion, his speed faster than humanly possible. The shadow blurred into another figure, a technician who had stepped into the room. Zhang's hand shot out, grabbing the man by the shoulder and slamming him into the wall. Everything stopped. Zhang stood there, breathing heavily, the technician frozen in fear beneath his grip. The room was dead silent except for the sound of Zhang's labored breaths. "Zhang, release him." Dr. Li's voice was firm but gentle. Zhang blinked, his mind struggling to catch up with his body. He looked at the technician, saw the panic in his eyes, and slowly loosened his grip. The technician stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. Zhang's eyes widened in horror as he realized what had just happened. "I'm sorry," he whispered, backing away, his body trembling. Dr. Li was already at his side, her hand on his arm. "It's okay, Zhang. You need to learn to control this, but it's going to take time." "I didn't mean to, I know," she interrupted. "But you see the problem now, don't you? You can't let the instincts take over. Not even for a second. They're always there, ready to pull you in." Zhang nodded, swallowing hard. He felt sick, disgusted with himself. But deep down, something inside him was beginning to understand. This wasn't just about fighting his instincts. It was about learning to live with them, to control them, to make them part of who he was without letting them tear him apart. The following days were a blur of intense training. The controlled environment worked, sort of. Zhang struggled with each session, his body rebelling against the slow pace, the limitations they imposed on him. But there were moments of progress, fleeting instances when he could control the urges that had once consumed him. And with each small victory, Zhang felt a little more human, but the instincts were still there, lurking just beneath the surface. They were always with him, waiting for the right moment to break free. Zhang knew that. The question was, could he keep them in check? As the days stretched into weeks, Zhang found himself asking a different question entirely: what happens if I can't? The days blurred into a haze of wires, monitors, and controlled environments. Every waking moment felt like a battle, between who Zhang was before the procedure and the strange, primal force inside him, clawing to break free. The isolation room was his world now, a small, sterile space where every sound, every movement, was magnified to unbearable proportions. He had long since stopped counting the hours, the days. Time had become irrelevant. It was only the fight that mattered. He had learned to control the sensory overload, at least to some degree. The eagle vision no longer caused him physical pain. He could turn it off, like a dial, pushing it into the background of his mind when it became too much. The rush of speed still threatened to take over, but Dr. Lee and the team had developed methods to rein him in, distractions, timed releases, exercises to calm his mind before the impulse hit. As for the strength, it was the most difficult to manage. There were still moments when his body itched to pick up something heavy and move it, but he had learned, mostly, to fight the instinct to rearrange the world around him. The worst part, however, was the rage. It wasn't anger. It was pure, unadulterated rage, an animal fury that flared in his chest with no clear trigger. It was in his blood, in his muscles. It came from the leopard inside him, the creature that wanted to rip, to tear, to destroy. And it would come in surges, at odd moments, when Zhang was least prepared for it. He'd find himself clenching his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. He could feel the animal pacing inside him, like a caged beast, and sometimes, just sometimes, he wanted to let it out. That was when Dr. Lee would intervene, pulling him back with a calm voice, with instructions to breathe, to focus. It worked, most of the time, but not always. It happened again one afternoon, when Zhang was deep in meditation, trying to push the animal thoughts from his mind. His legs were crossed, his eyes closed, and he was breathing steadily, fighting the familiar pressure behind his eyes, the rapid thrum of his pulse. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the machines surrounding him. And then the door opened. Zhang's body responded before his mind could process it. His muscles tensed, his heartbeat quickened, and the vision in his mind snapped to attention, hyper-focused. The door swung open with a soft creak, and through the crack of his eyelids, he saw Dr. Lee step in, her form breaking the otherwise still atmosphere. The disruption was subtle, but to Zhang, it was like an alarm ringing in his ears, his breath caught, his instincts surging. He could feel the animal within him, the leopard, rippling to life. The world shifted, blurred. He was no longer just Zhang Chen, the man fighting to control the animal instincts inside. No, for a split second, he was the animal, fast, ferocious, driven. The predator. He shot to his feet, his breath ragged, the tension in his body like a coiled spring. "Zhang, wait." Dr. Lee's voice was firm, but the words were too late. Zhang didn't hear her. All he could see was Dr. Lee, standing there with a look of shock on her face, frozen in place. His vision narrowed, focusing only on her. The rage flared up like a wildfire, and in an instant, he moved. But before he could take another step, his body slammed into the metal door frame. His vision swam as a wave of dizziness took over. He had moved too fast, too far, his body rebelling against his will. The burst of energy had sent him crashing to the floor, but even as he hit the ground, the animal inside was still there, urging him to get up, to attack. Zhang squeezed his eyes shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Focus." He heard Dr. Lee's voice again, this time softer, more insistent. "Zhang, calm down." He squeezed his fists tight, the nails digging into his palms. The pressure built up in his chest, like a storm about to break loose. But then something in Dr. Lee's voice stopped him. It wasn't anger or panic, but a quiet command. A reminder of the control he was desperately trying to maintain. "Zhang," she repeated, stepping closer. "You don't need to fight. Not like this." The words broke through the haze, and slowly, slowly, the fire inside him started to dissipate. His breathing evened out. The impulse to lash out faded, replaced by something else, something softer. Something human. When Zhang opened his eyes, Dr. Lee was standing in front of him, her expression unreadable. Her gaze flicked to his hands, still clenched into fists. Slowly, he opened them, exhaling deeply. It was hard. It was always hard. But it was getting easier. He stood up, feeling the weight of his body pressing down on him, heavy with the exhaustion of the struggle. "I don't know what's happening to me anymore," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I can't control it. I can't trust myself." Dr. Li placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not the only one fighting this, Zhang. We're all in this together. We're not giving up on you." Zhang wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust that this recalibration, this attempt to bring him back to balance, could work. But deep down, he wasn't sure. The rage, the fury that lived inside him, was always there, just below the surface, waiting for the right moment to tear through his humanity like a storm. He didn't know how much longer he could keep it at bay. The following week, Zhang was called into the main laboratory for a new round of tests. The routine had become all too familiar: more monitoring, more analysis, more data. They had measured his response to various stimuli, running tests on his reactions, his ability to control the animal urges. Zhang had grown used to the endless cycle of it all, and though he knew the researchers were doing their best, he couldn't help but feel like a lab rat, constantly poked, prodded, and observed. Dr. Li was there, of course. She always was. The last few days, though, she'd been quieter than usual, her brow furrowed with concentration, her gaze distant as she observed his behavior. Zhang sat in a chair, facing a wall of screens, all flashing with real-time data about his vitals, his neural activity, and his body's response to the experiments. He wasn't sure how much of it he understood, but he could tell it was all going according to plan. His breathing was steady. His heart rate was under control. The animal instincts, at least in this moment, were subdued. "How are you feeling today?" Dr. Li's voice broke through the silence, pulling Zhang's focus back to her. He glanced at her, noting the slight weariness in her eyes. The strain of the constant work, of trying to help him regain control. He could see it now, in the way she carried herself. It wasn't just his battle anymore, it had become hers too. "I'm okay," Zhang replied, his voice surprisingly steady. "I think I'm getting the hang of it." "The instincts, I mean." Dr. Li didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied the data on the screens, her fingers moving across the keyboard. "You're making progress," she said after a long pause, "but there's something I need to tell you. Something we've discovered in the last few days." Zhang looked up at her. "What is it?" She hesitated before continuing. "We've been running simulations to measure the extent of the modifications in your brain. The changes are deeper than we realized. The animal instincts are more embedded in your neural pathways than we initially thought." Zhang frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Dr. Li said softly, "that these instincts, this animal side of you, might not ever go away completely. The recalibration can help you control them, but you may never be fully rid of them. They're part of you now, Zhang. In a way, they always will be." A heavy silence settled between them. Zhang's mind raced. If the animal instincts were permanent, if they were always going to be with him, then what did that mean for his future? Was he destined to live in constant conflict with himself? Would he ever truly be human again? I don't know what to do with that," Zhang said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Dr. Li looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't have an answer for you, Zhang. But I do know one thing: you're not alone in this. We'll keep working, together, to find a way forward. To help you live with this. Whatever it takes." Zhang nodded slowly, though the weight of her words pressed down on him. Could he accept this? Could he learn to live with the constant presence of the animal inside him? He wasn't sure. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something else, a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way forward after all. A way to live with the wild instincts, without letting them consume him. He wasn't ready to give up yet. Zhang woke to the familiar buzz of the monitoring equipment, the steady hum of machines that had become his constant companions. The room felt colder today, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. The light from the overhead fluorescents cast sharp, artificial shadows on the walls, and for a moment, he wished he could just close his eyes and lose himself to the darkness. But that wasn't an option anymore. Not for him. The animal instincts had become a weight he carried with every breath, every step. There was no escape from them. Not fully. Dr. Lee had been right. No matter how much they tried to recalibrate him, the primal forces that had been embedded in his body were not going away. They were part of him now, and for better or worse, he had to find a way to live with them. It had been days since their last major breakthrough. The recalibration process had brought fleeting moments of peace, but it had also triggered a strange realization inside him. The animal instincts were not just reactive forces, they were part of his nature now, his second skin. The hunger to move, to tear through the world with impossible speed, to possess the strength of 10 men, these things were no longer just impulses, they were his companions, constant and unyielding. Sitting up slowly, Zhang ran a hand over his face. His muscles felt stiff, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself the luxury of quiet. But it didn't last long. In the distance, a siren wailed, shrieking like a warning from some far-off corner of his mind. It was sharp, piercing. His senses picked it up almost immediately, the sound cutting through his thoughts with surgical precision. His heart rate spiked. Zhang's eyes darted to the nearest window. In the distance, the city was alive, bustling as usual. Pedestrians wandered the streets, cars honked, and overhead, a bird wheeled in the sky. The scene should have been calm, should have been just another part of the rhythm of everyday life. But it wasn't. Not for Zhang. The siren's shrill call had awakened something in him, something visceral. He could hear it now, too clearly, too intensely, the sound of the wind rushing through the trees, the faint crack of a distant door slamming, the staccato thrum of footsteps, the beat of his own pulse. The pressure inside his head grew, a tension that constricted tighter and tighter. It was as if the world had magnified, every detail amplifying in his mind, pulling him apart. He closed his eyes. Focus. He had to focus. Slowly, he took a breath, pushing the roar of his senses back. But the pressure wouldn't dissipate. It wouldn't let go. His fingers clenched into fists. The strength inside him, the raw power of the animal, tugged at his control, demanding release. His mind rebelled. He could feel it, the gnawing hunger of the leopard, the primal force that was ready to snap. His fingers trembled as they gripped the armrest of the chair. It was then that Dr. Lee appeared at the door. "Zhang," she said, her voice gentle, but there was an edge to it. She stepped inside, locking eyes with him. "How are you feeling today?" Zhang didn't answer immediately. His gaze fixed on her, and for a moment, he could see the tension in her face, the wariness in her eyes. She had been monitoring him, as always, but today was different. Today, there was a certain hesitation in her movements. She knew, he knew, something wasn't right. "I'm fine," Zhang finally said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. "It's just hard to control sometimes. The impulses." Dr. Lee stepped closer, her brow furrowed in concern. "You're not alone in this, Zhang. We've been working on recalibrating the system, but there are still parts of you that we need to address. The strength, the speed, the sensory overload, they're all still there, still pushing at the boundaries." Zhang's fists clenched again, the surge of energy crawling beneath his skin. "What does that mean? What's next?" he asked, his voice edged with frustration. Dr. Lee hesitated. "We've been considering a new approach. Something more intensive." Zhang's eyes narrowed. "Intensive? What does that mean? More tests? More isolation?" She shook her head. "No. We're going to take a different route. We've been working on a solution that might help balance your instincts more effectively. A treatment." Zhang blinked. "A treatment? What kind of treatment?" A neurological reset, she said, her voice lower now, almost as though she was testing the words. It's still experimental, but it could help recalibrate your brain's response to the animal instincts. We've seen positive results in animal trials, though we've never applied it to a human before. Zhang didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. The idea of a reset sounded like a clean slate, a chance to remove the gnawing pressure of his new instincts, to return to a more controlled version of himself. But it also sounded like another experiment, a gamble. And what if it didn't work? What if the reset took something from him that he wasn't willing to lose? How would it work? Zhang asked slowly, his voice tinged with suspicion. Dr. Li took a deep breath. We'd use a combination of neurostimulation and targeted genetic therapy. The idea is to use the technology we've developed to weaken the more dominant instincts and allow the human mind to regain control. It's risky. But it could be the next step in your recovery. Zhang didn't know what to think. It sounded like a miracle. It sounded like madness. But one thing was clear, he couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. And maybe this was his chance. When he didn't immediately respond, Dr. Li continued. I understand that this is a lot to process. But you don't have to make a decision right now. Take your time, think about it. But know that we're here, we're all working toward the same goal, to help you regain control. Zhang nodded, though inside, his mind was a storm. Was this the answer he'd been searching for? Or was it just another layer of uncertainty, another risk? Either way, he knew one thing, the animal inside him was growing stronger by the day. The pull was becoming harder to ignore. For the rest of the day, Zhang tried to focus on something, anything, to distract himself from the growing pressure in his mind. He worked through exercises, practiced keeping his instincts at bay, trying to remember what it felt like to be in control. But the weight of his decision loomed over him, dragging his thoughts in different directions. He found himself pacing, unable to settle. Later that night, as he lay in bed, his body still buzzing with tension, his mind drifted to a memory he hadn't thought about in a long time. His childhood. He remembered running through the fields near his home, the wind in his hair, the feeling of freedom that came from moving at his own pace. He had been fast then, not like a leopard, not like the creature he was now, but fast enough to outrun his own shadow. There had been no weight on his shoulders back then, no fear of what lurked beneath his skin. That freedom seemed so distant now. He was no longer that boy, he wasn't even really a man anymore, was he? He was something else, something different. But was that who he wanted to be? Was this new version of him worth the cost? The next morning, Zhang stood at the window, looking out over the city. The sun was just rising, casting a golden hue over the buildings below. Everything seemed so ordinary, so untouched. But nothing felt ordinary to Zhang anymore. He had changed. He had been changed. Dr. Li's offer of a reset echoed in his mind. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, what he was searching for, but he knew he couldn't stay trapped in this half-life forever. Something had to give. Something had to change. His heart raced as he made his decision. It's time, he thought. Time to see if I can be human again.